Hello, welcome to today's Planter Session webinar, Are Christmas and Easter Losing Their Gospel Edge? Brought to you again by Geneva Push. My name's Ben McKeck and I'm going to be your moderator today. Now, throughout our webinar, we're encouraging you to interact with our speakers. You can do that by typing questions into the question pane on your GoToWebinar control panel. We're going to answer your questions live straight after our initial interview, so make sure you get your questions in early. We're also recording today's webinar, and we're going to send you a link showing you how to get to the audio and video file within the next couple of days. Now, before we do get underway, though, we'd first like to thank our supporters who make these webinars possible. Christian Super is one of the driving forces behind Geneva Push's Planter Sessions. Now, if you haven't arranged a superannuation for your church plant yet, we highly recommend you start with a chat with Christian Super. So head across to christiansuper.com.au. That's for super that's invested biblically in line with your Christian values. And also making things happen at the Planter Sessions are the team at EA Insurance. If you haven't sorted out the insurance side of church planting yet, then we recommend you start with a chat with EA. So go to ea.org.au. Now, it's on to our host for today, Scott Sanders. Scott Sanders, as most of you are aware, I'm sure, is Executive Director at Geneva Push. Scott, I'm going to bring you into this conversation and let you take us away through this, what's going to be a fascinating topic, Are Christmas and Easter Losing Their Gospel Edge? Over to you, Scott.
Great, thanks, Ben. It's great to be here for another webinar just after celebrating the death and resurrection of Jesus during Easter weekend. I just want to introduce Ed Stetzer. Ed's planted, revitalised and pastored churches. He's trained pastors and church planters on 5 continents, holds 2 master's degrees, 2 doctorates, has written dozens of articles, books, is a regular contributor of Christianity Today. He's a columnist for Outreach Magazine and Catalyst Monthly. He serves on the Advisory Council of Sermon Central and Christianity Today's Building Church Leaders, and is a frequently cited and interviewed in news outlets such as USA Today, CNN. It's great to have Ed here today, and I'm really looking forward to his insights into Christmas and Easter. So welcome, Ed.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Ed, it was interesting. I shared with you before what happened over the course of the weekend. I was about to we had our friends over from school on Thursday, on the Thursday before Easter. They were about to head off as a lot of Australians do for the long weekend, off to see family and friends. Our friend gave me a kiss on the cheek, said Happy Easter, turned to her kids and said, Easter, it's really important and big weekend for Scott, and then said Happy Easter and said have a great weekend. It's interesting in our current climate, in our current cultural climate, Christmas and Easter. We want to think into that today. And so, what do you think? Are Christmas and Easter losing their gospel edge?
Well, I do think there's a certain sense that all religious opportunities in an increasingly secularized society are kind of losing their impact. The question is, has it lost its impact? To mix metaphors, has the ship sailed on this? And I would say, to answer the question is, are they losing? Yes. Have they lost? No, nowhere close, I think, to having lost that. And I think part of that is that societies in the Western world, right? So we're talking in the English-speaking world, we're talking Australia, we're talking the UK, we're talking the US, Canada, and New Zealand for that matter. They still have a pretty substantive identification with some sort of Christianity. Matter of fact, in Australia, as you know, Christianity is still the religion that most Australians actually identify with, 61%, and this declined slightly since 2006. And the Canadian census Canadian and Australian census asked these questions. The U.S. Census, by the way, does not. So whenever I get to look at the Australian census data, I'm always excited. It doesn't ask it all the time, but it asks consistently about religion. So that's helpful. And of course, that's how you end up with these Jedi followers that you Australian census always find. But I think it's important to note that 61% say in the 2011 census that that they're Christians. Now what that means is very different to different people. For example, what we'll see is the one of the things I wrote recently, an article for USA Today, which is sort of our national newspaper, kind of popular newspaper. I divided the category up. In Americans, it's about 75%. In Australians, it's down to 61%. And others, New Zealand's a little lower, and the UK is a little higher. So it's sort of a mix. Canada a little higher still. But what you have to do is you have to remember that of that 61%, that only a fraction of that 61% of Australians who self-identify as Christians, and we'll call them Christians for the sake of this statistical discussion, only 61%, or of 61%, a fraction of them are what we might call convictional Christians. And again, we're letting them self-identify, so we're talking about people who call their religion Christianity. So that would be evangelicals, which would be the primary consumers of this podcast. It would be Roman Catholics, for that matter. It would be different groups, different faith groups inside and outside of evangelicalism. But of those, that's just a portion of it. Perhaps the largest percentage of that is actually people who are not convictional Christians. We would define Christian even differently than just conviction, but as actually being changed by the power of the gospel. But for the sake of the demographics, another huge chunk of that is what I called in the article congregational Christians. They're people who are what we call sometimes Christers, Christmas and Easter Christians, but they have some vague, loose connection. Maybe they're from an Anglican background, or maybe they're in the Uniting Church, but maybe they're baptized as an infant, but maybe they got married in church, but they don't. There's not a real convictional faith commitment. They're not ordering their lives around anything related to faith and the faith journey. So they're congregational Christians. The third category of Christian is cultural Christian. I mean, there are a lot of people in Australia who say that they're Christians because they're not Sikhs, they're not Muslims, they're not Jewish, they're not Hindu. So therefore, the option they choose to identify is Christian. It doesn't mean much to them, to be perfectly honest. When we look at the fact that 60% of Australians say that they're Christians, yet when we begin to sort of look at that data, only 35% of Australians actually, according to research at McCrindle, only 35% believe Jesus had divine powers and was the Son of God. So there are people, and this is really key, there are people who call themselves Christians who do not think that Jesus had divine powers and was the Son of God. So these are just cultural Christians. They're census Christians. They fill out a census or a survey. They don't want to say they're an atheist, because no one. I mean, atheists just have a bad reputation. They don't want to say that they're Hindu because they're not. So they say that they're Christian. So when you look at those groups, you sort of get a picture of well, who's here in this mix. Well, let's take a look. Okay, so we go ahead and go back to the slide here. I haven't hit on the slides that we have. Go back to the slide that says growth in the spiritual but not religious category. So we have a substantial number of people who call themselves Christians, but when we look, the growing category, the fastest growing category, is actually the spiritual but not religious category, and we're going to see more and more people in that category. Now, excuse me, keep in mind that a lot of people are going to call themselves Christian and spiritual but not religious. There's going to be some overlap at times in those categories. But if you look again, there's still religious identity. Next slide. There's still religious identity, and this is Olive Tree Media and McCrindle Research. I apologize, got a little cough here. Is that those who said they were religious, right? Only 13% are actively involved in actually practicing this. So you have a lot of people who consider themselves religious, who call themselves Christians, but that convictional category, that practicing Christian, is actually lower. And so I think we want to get a picture of actually what Christian is if we're going to have this discussion rightfully. And then the next slide is the one I was referring to. Is that again, a lot of if 61% say they're Christians, but only 35%, almost half, or a little more than half, say that they are, no, this slide says significant belief in Jesus, but only 35% say he had divine powers and was Son of God. There's actually pretty good confusion about what Christianity actually is. But okay, so here's the issue, right?
It's interesting you categorize so the convictional, the congregational, the cultural. I guess are you thinking of a Sunday, during Easter, during Christmas, the majority of people in your church are going to be obviously convictional, and then it's the congregational Christians that are coming more likely than the cultural Christians to a church, to a church service during Easter or Christmas. Have you got a sense of, who's actually, putting their hand up and saying, we'll be at church? I mean, use the term Creaster there. We often would joke about Anglicans being C of E, so Christmas and Easter only, Christians. That's the cultural church, I guess, in Australia, the Church of England or the Anglican Church. Have you got a sense of, who's actually showing up in that broader 61% or 75% who would call themselves Christian, to a church service on a Sunday?
Yeah, so let's say that we divide, and it doesn't divide equally perfectly this way, but of that 61%, let's say a third are convictional, a third are congregational, a third are cultural. Here's what I think. I think the cultural Christians are less likely to be reached at Easter, but this is the time, Easter and Christmas is the time when, if they're going to be reached or open, they're most likely to be reached and open. So if you look at the last slide in the data there, it says Australians are warm towards Christianity, as demonstrated by high identity with it, and similarly strong belief in Jesus, and some believe he's Jesus, the Son of God. But here's what I would say. So Easter and Christmas are the times when your convictional Christians are going to be there, and they're going to be motivated to reach out. Statistically, we know that Easter and Christmas, it's actually Christmas is highest and Easter is the second highest, are the times when people are most open to spiritual conversations based on our Life Right research data. So what I would say is that your most likely targets are going to be, maybe the word target's the wrong word here, the most likely opportunities, where there's still a gospel opportunity, is going to be towards your congregational Christians who are loosely affiliated, to a lesser degree to your cultural Christians who are nominally connected at all, and then it's a cultural oddity to non-Christians. It might be, they might want to come to, see what Christmas is about, is just as if a Muslim might invite us to Ramadan activities, or a Jewish person to Passover activities. It's a cultural phenomenon that they may want to learn from. So less open, but not without still opportunity. As a pastor and as a Christian, I will tell you, I lead my people and I encourage my people to seize these moments, Easter and Christmas, as gospel opportunities, recognizing that over time they're less and less so.
Yeah, great. Well, it'd be helpful to you've already brought in your understanding of the American context. You said that Christmas was more higher in terms of attendance than Easter. What are some of the American views on Christmas and Easter? What have you learned from the research you've been doing at Lifeway?
Yeah, well, first let me say that not everyone we've had the chance to meet everyone, and so not everyone knows that I actually try not to spend a lot of time on American research while in Australia, and I try to have a little bit of a self-deprecating humor about the difference between Australians and Americans, and so I am very much aware of the differences statistically and the caution that has to be undertaken. But let me say that we find similar numbers in Australian data, just compressed. Again, in the order, in religiosity, that's a research term, religiosity, with Christian religiosity, the U.S. and the Western world would be the highest. But and Australia would not be the lowest, but close to the lowest. And so just the compression of numbers. However, what we find is 63% of Americans say that people should visit church for Christmas. Now, let's say that we want to lower those numbers in the Australian context, and I think we can and we should. There's a difference of 15 points between people who self-identify as Christians and people who don't, between the two, 14 to be exact. So let's lower that by 13 points. Well, still we have almost half of people, and we'll see in just a minute some research in Australia that confirms this, who say we should visit Christmas, or that Christmas should be more about Jesus, almost 80%, or 70% say Christmas would be better with a Christian focus. So we see very consistently a openness that people recognize that Christmas and Easter are indeed religious holidays, even though they may not celebrate it. For some people, it's like yoga. Many people take yoga unaware or unconcerned of its religious roots or connection. Well, all kinds of Australians celebrate Christmas and Easter unaware or unconcerned about its religious connections. However, for a lot of people, they think it should be there and they'd like to see more of it.
And that's the McCrindle research that was done last Christmas, so in 2014. So we're indebted to good research organisations like McCrindle as well, who again, saw that 92% say that religious traditions of Christmas should be encouraged. So there's, even in Australia, there's a positivity towards people being able to celebrate and respect different faith traditions. I'm not too sure about how high it would be for maybe some other religious traditions, but at least in the Christmas and Easter side of things, there's an encouragement to be able to celebrate it and do it. It's interesting. The McCrindle data also says that less than 1 in 5 Australians wish for a white Christmas. For most, it's about backyard cricket, outdoor carols, beach visits, the Sydney to Hobart, and Boxing Day tests. So what's interesting, I think, for a lot of people about Christmas is that it's a holiday time. It's a time actually to spend time with your family, and so it's not so much about celebrating the birth of Jesus or his death and his resurrection, but it's about that holiday time. Ed, in Australia we have Good Friday holiday off, and we also have Easter Monday. So the whole weekend is a long weekend. So there's a big exodus out of the city. In Sydney anyway, the roads are clogged, and people are heading off, for their holidays. As you said, it gives us an opportunity, though, for the most of the population to actually take the opportunity to share Jesus, to invite people to church. And what's interesting is the data is obviously saying there's an openness, so we should have confidence in inviting our friends, inviting those in our street to our local church services. Ed, I want to get you into a different area a little bit, but it flows. If culture is such a big factor, how do you recommend engaging with culture? How do you what are the different models of cultural engagement that the church needs to be thinking through?
Okay. Considering that I'm the worst interviewee ever, because I want to actually come back to something you said just a minute ago, if I could, and then come to that. You mentioned that 92% of people say religious traditions should be encouraged in Australia. And so secular society, more secular than most of the Western context, and yet 92% say religious traditions should be encouraged. Now, a couple of things. First, that's a remarkably high percentage. We'd say a freakishly high percentage. Keep in mind that a certain percentage of people will just say no to whatever. 7% of Americans will say when asked that the first moon landing was faked. So you've got 8% of people saying this. So in other words, 8% of people are just going to say no to everything that they're asked. So this is virtually overwhelming. Now, in missiology, Scott and our listeners, one of the things that we talk about is you look for the redemptive window through which the gospel can shine, and that goes back to a book called Peace Child and some things related to that. But to me, the fact that 92% of people in Australia say religious traditions should be encouraged is a remarkable opportunity to define what religious traditions would be good, and certainly that would include for a lot of people church attendance, and to seize that opportunity as indeed a gospel opportunity. So I didn't want to quickly go past this without mentioning a little more just the freakishly high percentage and the opportunity that affords us. And I would tell you that as a pastor and as a church leader, I would not walk subtly past that number. First of all, I'd make sure that I'm encouraging people in my church to actually engage in Christian traditions that are built around. There's all kinds of traditions that have built up in the Western world, but what are Christian traditions? I would help them not just invite their friends to church, but invite their friends into Christmas traditions. Are we doing an Advent wreath? Are we doing this? Is this something that we can invite our neighbors to, or teach our neighbors to do, or share? So again, look at this as a redemptive window, a redemptive opportunity, a a way where people's hearts are prepared. They say, not you say and I say, Scott, but they say that religious traditions should be encouraged. So let's say to them, here are some what they call religious traditions, what we would call Christian pictures of the gospel that are explained in the Advent, but then point them ultimately, hopefully, to a church service where they can hear the gospel more clearly articulated. So again, I apologize for coming back to that, but I just think it's so important. I don't want to.
Yeah, that's simple. It's interesting. Chatting to a number of our church planners, it's most of our church planners don't have a church building. So it's not as easy to get access to a church building on Good Friday, but that forces them to be creative and to grab those religious traditions, as you say. So it was interesting. A number of our church plants had a Passover meal on the Thursday night. Obviously, Anglicans celebrate Maundy Thursday. But they used, I guess they used the fact that they don't have a church building or they don't have a place to actually, push the celebration into community group level, into home group level, and also into thinking, well, how can we celebrate Easter and get people to think into Passover, the death of Jesus, have a great meal together. Others actually use secular traditions like, the Easter egg hunt. So unfortunately here in Sydney we had terrible rain, so a number of Easter egg hunts were handed out, but I spoke to a pastor yesterday, a planter yesterday, who said that meant they had 500 spare eggs. They quickly printed up flyers and they handed out at the local railway station Easter eggs and a flyer inviting people to their church. Now they had 2 people, come in response to that, and so now they're actively following up those 2 people. So as you say, there's a redemptive window. There's that can be grabbed to, have people come along to you.
Awesome examples. Yep, awesome.
Yeah. Good. Well, let's get on to culture. What are the different models then of cultural engagement that we can have as a church?
Yeah, well, I've been writing and thinking about this lately as we're kind of in this great shift. There's not been recently a huge drop in church attendance. There's actually a new study out in Canada that shows among those convictional Christians actually been a bit of an uptick. We see similarly in the UK. Now again, these are uptick from low numbers, but what's happening is that that mushy middle of people who call themselves Christians are changing their worldview. Many of them are just dropping the label Christian because they weren't anyway, and so that means culture is becoming in some ways more secularized. The fastest growing category in the West is people people of no faith, the nuns, the none of the aboves. We call them, not the nuns, the nice Catholic ladies who with hats, but the nuns are the none of the aboves on a survey form. So with that growing, there's been an increasing secularization of the population, and with that, again, increasing secularization of the popular discourse. So that's made it a little bit more challenging for Christians. And so I wrote an article to which you referred to here, different models of cultural engagement, and I talked about there are 3 ways that I think Christians will increasingly engage culture in the Western world. One of them is to be culture engagers. Now, get my cards on the table. This is my particular area of interest. My PhD is in missiology. I want to teach people to engage culture well, share the good news of the gospel. I want to help churches that are culturally disconnected to be better connected. I want the gospel to be communicated in contextually appropriate ways. I can preach this sermon all day. And so that is, if anyone follows my writing, that's something I'm very passionate about, and I think is still a great need in Australia. There are many churches that fill with people who love Jesus, but don't know how to engage the context around them. So culture engagers was the first category, but that's not the only way I think people will engage culture. I think another is there are going to be people who are cultural defenders in the changing cultural milieu. I think the reality is that in the West, there is a increasing, it's not a persecution. I appreciate what the Archbishop of Canterbury said about that. Justin Welby said, let's not call this persecution. It's just not. There are people who really are dying for their faith, but there is an increasing intolerance for what the world sees as the intolerance of our faith. And so I think there are going to be some people, and I will tell you, this is one that I am less excited about personally, but see necessary culturally. There are going to be people who advocate for the role and even the rights of people of faith in the public square. And so this wanes and it's It can change depending upon leadership and government and things of that sort. And even here, I mean, you have you see the same waning there. You'll have one leader who's more open to the issues of faith. I mean, current devout Catholic, former seminarian in Tony Abbott, and so it's different depending upon who's in office and things of that sort. But there's a sense that Christians feel, and I think rightfully so, that there's an increasing uncertainty of how to deal with them when they won't come along with the program. On the changing views of morality, they won't come along with the program on the changing views of culture, and they continue to insist on these antiquated and narrow views. So I think there are going to be people who have to advocate in the public square. It's not something that I've done or I do a lot, but I think it's necessary and will be increasingly necessary in the West. The third category that I talked about was the culture creators. And again, I just full disclosure, I am not a culture creator. I am a culture engager. But I think as we look to culture and the cultural situation we find ourselves in, we're going to need an increasing number of people who might tell an alternative story. I think it was Ivan Illich who was once asked, how do you bring about change in a society? And he said, well, you can do it through revolution, tear it down and start over. You could do it through reform, slow incremental change. But he said that the best way was to tell an alternative story that people are drawn to in the telling. That's not the exact quote, but you get the point. Well, I think as Christians we need some culture creators who tell an alternative story in film or in art or in other or in other means in storytelling, that people say, oh, that's what the Christian worldview. And I don't mean that the story ends and everybody becomes a Christian and there's a cross that raises in the background of the film. I mean more of this is what a worldview looks like. This is what human flourishing would look like if we kind of lived and thought in the ways that the scriptures lay out. So cultural creators, are increasingly people who are engaging the centers of culture in and around the world. So I think, and again, I mean, Australia is such key here. Australia is disproportionately influential for its size and its population in the global conversation when it comes to culture creation. And so with that being said, I think there'll be culture engagers like me that will help churches and Christians engage their culture faithfully and effectively. Culture defenders who are going to help deal with the issues in society to make sure the public square still has a place for Christian voices. And then culture creators are going to show an alternative way, a better way of what it looks like when we live out who we are in the Imago Dei, or we live out who we are when the world is more just or made more right because people actually care. So that's my thesis in that article. It actually came up in a conversation with people at the Colson Center, and they've been using it now as a framework. Colson Center is kind of a well-known worldview organization here in the States and globally as well. So that's how I see the shift.
And I'm interested to hear what does this look like for one of your church members? How do you explain this to one of your church members as they're having a conversation with their neighbour over the backyard fence? As they're at work, having a conversation about same-sex marriage, or hopefully having a gospel conversation. Telling that alternative story. I mean, increasingly in Australia, we've got first-generation migrants who have never heard the gospel story before. So, it is an alternative story. The Christian worldview is jarring compared to a number of other worldviews out there that their understanding of creation, of God or the spiritual system is very different. How do you use these three areas, or how do you explain these three areas to one of your members of your church?
Yeah, and I would say that probably it's more of a framework that I use, and I want to encourage people in my church to, we live in Nashville, which is kind of the capital of music in the United States, at least, and some would say the world. And so, as such, how do I encourage the artists in our church? The country music songwriter of the year to the last several years attends our church, and so how does what he does influence? Is influenced by his worldview. That's a Christian worldview, and so culture engagers. That's something we seek to do as a church. So even we talked about Easter here. We just had a major focus at our church. We actually had about 2,000 to 3,000 people come to our Easter egg hunt that you mentioned, and we invited people to church. Our movie theater is right next to the field where we do the Easter egg hunt. So all those things are exactly applied, but they're applied in different ways. I would say culture defenders. I'm very careful because I want to carefully articulate issues of justice and issues of liberty, but I want to do so without some of the vitriol that's evident, at least in the discourse in my country. Christians have not articulated well about these issues, so we do so carefully, cautiously, but we do so, on a regular basis because we think it's necessary.
Yeah. Thanks, Ed. I guess most people don't know that you're a pastor. They often see you as a missiologist or as the guy, the numbers guy, the stats guy. You've talked about doing an Easter egg hunt just then at Grace Church. What else did what did Easter weekend look like? What did Good Friday, Easter Sunday look like for you as a church?
Well, we made a big deal of Jesus because we think that's important. What we do in both of those opportunities, we see there are probably 4 times in the life of our church that we see sort of an opportune moment. So four times on a yearly cycle, we say this is a key time of outreach for us. They are spring and fall, beginnings of spring and fall, and has to do with the school year. People get back into the swing of things, and they are Christmas and Easter. And so specifically, what we try to do is, number one, we try to, Christmas and Easter, we try to have events that mobilize our people to engage our community. So we did the Easter egg hunt. We do the Easter egg hunt every year. We do at Christmas time. We do Christmas activities each year. It might be singing Christmas carols and communities, things of that sort. So we do those kind of things. We do in the fall. We recognize people as school gets back into session. For us in the fall, we recognize this is an opportunity. So we'll launch a new series. I'll talk about that in a minute. We'll launch a new series in the fall. But also, for example, we do to not offend all of our listeners, on Reformation Day, which is October 31st, which some pagans might call Halloween, but we don't, Scott. You and I don't. We do. We actually don't do a church activity on Halloween evening because I want to be home and I want to be out on the one night of the year when my neighbors will come to my house and introduce themselves to me, and I get to go to my neighbor's house and introduce myself to them. So, we actually participate in those Reformation night activities, as we'll call them. We don't seek to kind of section off our church away from them. Though I understand some people convictionally do that. That's just not a conviction I have. However, we do in the basically kind of the commercial town square. We do the Pumpkin Festival. And so that's an opportunity. We talk to people. We co-sponsor it with it's kind of like an outside mall, and the towns in a local commerce town square. So we do those activities. So we're looking for activities to where we can mobilize our people. Second, we're starting a new series at each of those 4 times. So on Easter yesterday, I started a new day before yesterday. At the time of this recording, I started a new series, and we were going through a series of Who's God and a series of Understanding the Christian Faith. So we did that. I think because we're getting feedback. But we did Understanding Christian Faith. Here's why. I want to begin the series, and there's going to be a high point, Easter, Christmas, or beginning of fall, beginning of spring. But I want to invite them to come back regularly and consistently on the series. So that's all part of what we do. Also, lastly, we preach through books of the Bible at our church, except for those 4 times I started the feedback. Okay, I'm trying to figure out how to fix the feedback. So I think it went away. So what we try to do is to start those series, and we leave the book of the Bible. We're going through Matthew for 2 years, and so we call him Matt now. We're so close. But but what we do is we leave that series, and then we go into like a mini series right now. The mini series we're doing right now is called it's called The Who, and we're talking about who is God, and who is Christ on Easter, who is God, who are the disciples. Right now, a lot of people are talking about the disciples in the States because of this mini series on one of our TV networks called NBC. This mini series called AD. So who are the disciples? So just a 5-week series that's talking about those issues. And then we go back to Matthew. So we do that cyclically. So that's sort of how we seek to seize the opportunity that's before us.
Great, that's really helpful, Ed. I guess I want a final question before we go to questions from the audience. Is that question of, well, how do you make the most of Christmas and Easter? You've already talked about, obviously, it's all about Jesus, so you want to make the most of Jesus in both those times. That needs to be your focus and your priority. You've talked about starting a new series. Obviously, behind that is you've got new people coming. You actually want to invite them to something and get them engaged in church. How else do you make the most of that spike in attendance, of that new group of people that are actually coming into your church? How do you do it, and what can you recommend to the church planner or to the existing church as well?
Well, I guess what I would say, and I don't know how to make that go away, guys. I'm sorry. I think it's on the other side.
Yeah.
So there you go. Scott turns it off. I think it's good. So what I would say is I try to see how to put it. I try to see big days as on-ramps. In other words, the on-ramps are, so Christmas is an on-ramp, and around Christmas time what I try to do is talk about people, how you start your new year. And it's an on-ramp to considering the conversation. Now again, I want to be careful because, I mean, we're preaching the gospel, we're teaching the scriptures, but I want to teach and preach in such a way that I say to them, this will be continued next week, and you don't want to miss this. This Sunday, I quoted on Easter Sunday, I quoted the C.S. Lewis quote that Christianity if false is of no importance, if true, of infinite importance, but what it cannot be is moderately important. And so with that being said, I began and said, here's what we're going to talk about the next several weeks through this series, that Christianity cannot be moderately important. And I asked people specifically, I always present the gospel and invite people to trust and respond to Christ. But I said to them, for many of you, this is the first time you're here because it's Easter. You're just here because you kind of have to be. It's the law. But what I want to say to you is, if Christianity really can't be of moderate importance, would you just take 5 weeks with us, 4 more after this week? And that's the commitment I asked them. Take 4 more weeks and consider with us, is this too moderately important for you? Is it, or is it of no importance? And so we provide some resources. Last year we gave out Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Easter. We give us some other resources this year. But what I'm trying to do, Scott, is I'm trying to on-ramp people into a Christian community, not a covenant community. They're not church members because they're not followers of Jesus yet. But to get them to consider, just for a short time, 4 or 5 weeks, and that's why they can't be short. They can't be like we're going through the Gospel of Matthew, for 27 weeks a year. But it's 4 short weeks. Consider this with us, and then it gives us an opportunity to challenge. So what I wrote this article was, "Don't Waste Your Spike." Okay, that's the title of the article, because we had, our church was up, 50% on Easter Sunday. Our goal is to keep 4 or 5 families out of that who will hear the gospel, who will be changed by its power and become part of the life of the church.
So what do you do to plan to keep them? So you've obviously connected with them. They've come to the event. They've come to church. How you actually keeping them and holding on to them?
Yeah, so keeping them is the on-ramp is getting them in the conversation. And then what we do specifically is we have like 2 or 3 weeks in, I'm trying to remember the dates, but 2 or 3 weeks after Easter, we have what we call a church chat, or a newcomers reception, or whatever it may be.
Yep.
What we do is we plan to get, if we get 6 or 7 families to come, we have 6 or 7 of our families come, and then 6 or 7 newcomer families come. Just meet after church, ask questions. Our next goal would be to get them, now they're sort of on-ramped into the conversation. Can we get them to come to to some sort of small group, or maybe a Christianity Explored course, or something, a 2 Ways to Live course, and a shameless plug to my friends at Matthias Media. Can we do some sort of deeper conversation? All this time we're having evangelistic conversations. Well, we're having relational conversations that lead to evangelistic conversations as well. So the end result is that we are bringing them through a process that leads ultimately to hearing the claims of the gospel, ultimately being in a Christian community in a small group. We'd like them to be regularly in a small group, and then taking the next steps of faith. In our case, it would be trusting and following Christ and being baptized are the next steps of faith. And consistently, Scott, we have found that every time we have done one of these things, we do them 4 times a year, that's where we are able to engage people in a fresh new way and to see life change take place.
So what's helpful, I think, just to sort of summarise, is have a plan. You've seen and identified the major times in the year where you have those spikes. We have people coming to your church, or having the relational opportunities to invite people to church. But you make the most of them by actually having a plan. Plan that new series. Plan how you're going to connect with them, but then plan how you're actually going to see them continue to remain as members of the church and make decisions to follow Christ. I've got one of the first questions coming through from our audience, Ed, and it's an important one. It's from Chris, and he says this: I can see how we want to make more of Christmas and Easter, but is our fascination with Christmas and Easter partly an avoidance of finding the ways to reach out to very different subcultures? So are we losing the gospel opportunities that we can have on the other 363 days of the year by focusing on these key critical times?
Yeah, I think the reason I want to focus on key critical times is because it helps create a pattern of outreach. So I don't, at the end of that Christmas season or Easter season or fall and spring, we're trying to teach our people to live on mission every day, to have a missional lifestyle is the term that I would use, to live as agents of God's mission, as kingdom citizens, ambassadors. So, but what I would say is that our experience has been, is that people, that maybe this kind of activity for a lot of people is like picking up and moving a refrigerator. Sometimes they just don't know where to start. They don't know how to get there. And so what this gives them, it gives them handholds. It gives them, like straps around a refrigerator. Okay, you can do this, and you can carry this. This is your call. This is your role. But then what happens is as they get more used to it and accustomed to it, they're more naturally adept at sharing the gospel. So what I would say is, I think it would be, and I think the person who asked the question is right. It would be an unhealthy thing if the end result were that we were to actually just limit our sharing of the gospel to 4 times a year. But I'll just be blunt, Scott, and is that I think for most people, getting them engaged 4 times a year, most people in our churches, is a huge step forward. So for me, I'm like, let's take the risk. Let's do the 4 times a year. Let's have 4 focal times a year. But then with those 4 focal times a year, let's teach them to live on mission every day, to as Paul writes, 2 Corinthians, to plead on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. And that's not it doesn't say afterwards on Christmas, Easter, fall, and spring. It says that we're ambassadors for Christ, certain that God is appealing through us. We plead on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God.
So the patterns about building that.
One more thing. It's a lot like a mission trip teaches people to share Christ, but if you only do it on a mission trip, you're doing it wrong.
Yeah. So the patterns about understanding the patterns is also about building that culture, a culture that then trains and equips so that the culture is an everyday culture rather than those 4 key times. And there's obviously people in your church who are the regular inviters. They're the regular evangelists. There are also those people who are the big E evangelists in your church who are just naturally gifted at having gospel conversations, and be that because of their workplace, be that because of their personality, and also because of just their giftedness, the way that God's wired them. And another question, just in follow-up from Chris, what makes you think convictional Christians are most likely to be there and reach out at Christmas and Easter? At Easter, especially, I find the opposite.
Yeah, I don't know your experience, so I certainly would not doubt it. It certainly could be indeed exactly what your journey has been. What we find is that in our research is twofold. Number one, people are most open, and people are most willing to make the invitation. I think when we look and say most people, when was the last time you invited people to church? Christmas would be number one, Easter would be number two, Mother's Day is actually number three, and the attendance patterns sort of line up with that as well. Now, Scott, you mentioned the traveling. A lot of times people are gone and it's different, but typically when you have a Good Friday, you have an Easter, people are more thoughtful about spiritual things and the opportunities there, and people tend to be more open that time than at other times.
Yeah, and in part as well, it's about is it about educating or your church members to say, hey, this is a really important time where you're going to have opportunities, where also people are going to be more likely to come to church. So, please decide not to go away on that long weekend. Please decide not to, to move away at Christmas, but actually to take the opportunity to invite your neighbour to church, to, stick around so that you're available. As you say, at Halloween, that's the worst night to put on a church meeting or, a church training night, because you actually want your people in their homes, answering doors, being involved in the community.
Yeah, and I think what we're trying to teach our people at our church is that we want to partner with them. So and I think that's a key phrase, is that we want to partner with our church on these outreach opportunities. So, for example, when we did the Easter outreach this year, we said we're going to partner with you and do this. We call it the Easter extravaganza. But then what we did is we don't actually just assume people will do this, and maybe this gets at the questioner's question. What we do is we actually will do kind of almost a phone tree. I actually will call the staff, and then the staff will call the key leaders, our life group leaders, our children's leaders, and say, hey, would you make sure we ask them to pray for 5 people, depending on the year, it might be 7 people that they're reaching out to. And so we actually call our leaders, and then our leaders call our people, and so our people call one another. And so we might have 100 calls going out before Easter and before Christmas, reminding people to pray for 5 people each and to reach out to 5 people each. We actually pass out little sheets of paper, little cards inside our program, our worship folder, and so people fill those out and they pray for them. So it's not just us standing up and say, listen, all you blokes, invite all your friends next week. It's a holistic approach. We send out a letter to everyone saying, hey, here's a little card, pray for these 5 people. So we're not just wishing that they would invite people. We're mobilizing them for that. So again, Easter, we have the Easter extravaganza. We have calls from staff to key leaders. We have key leaders calling all the people. We then send a letter to everyone who's visited our church. We call back all the people who visited in the last year. We do a direct mail piece into the community, and we know that we're not going to get a huge response, but by communicating all of those things together, we're mobilizing our church, and we tell our people, this is key. The postal service has not been given the message of reconciliation. You have been. You're ambassadors of reconciliation. So don't expect the mailer to bring somebody. That's your role. And so, but if you picture just in your head a whole mobilized congregation, then this together, we're not a super large church for the States either, but our whole congregation talking to one another and encouraging one another, provoking one another to love and good deeds, Hebrews 10:24, to reach out, that's how we mobilize the whole congregation for this kind of approach. And there's lots of other teams working. So we've got now more people on the greeter team. We've got more people on the ushers. You got more people, special worship, whatever it may be. So we mobilize the whole congregation.
Great, that's really helpful. We've got probably time for one more question, Ed. So it comes from Gaynor. Do you think that maybe the 92% of people who say religious traditions should be encouraged is due to their thinking that their country is being challenged by other mediums and they don't want to lose the tradition, as opposed to actually believing what the true meaning of Christmas is all about?
Well, absolutely. I mean, only 30-something% have any concept of what the true meaning of Christmas is all about, because only the percentage even think that Jesus was the Son of God and had divine powers. So that's absolutely the case. So it's not I mean, when we find a spiritual opportunity, we never really find a spiritual accuracy on some of those things. So it's just the opportunity that's there. I would also say too that 92% talk about those traditions, but keep in mind that a significant percentage of those people are not even nominal Christians, let alone convictional Christians. But there's a sense, and part of this is the incredibly high value that Australians and other people in the Western world kind of hold to this idea of tolerance. So you might get a similar question about Ramadan. You might get a similar question about the Hindu Festival of Lights. Should religious traditions of the Festival of Lights be encouraged? So absolutely. But the fact that number is so high, I don't think you'd get that high of a number. I'm certain you wouldn't get that high of a number asking about Ramadan or Festival of Lights or something else. So there is and I think we see this, McCrindle people talk about, there is a fondness for Christianity, and that's not the exact word that they use, but there's a warmth, I believe the word that they use, a warmth towards Christianity. So and it's not biblical Christianity, and there's always the stumbling block of the cross. But again, as I look to the Western context, including Australia, I still think there's gospel opportunity there. I don't think that means we just need to focus on cultural and congregational Christians. I think we need to reach the Pokot who have migrated from Africa, the Ebon who have migrated from Malaysia. I think that Christians in Australia, in a nation maybe not always known or in the Western world as well, but Australia in particular, not always known for engaging the foreigner, the immigrant, the stranger, that ultimately that has to be a part of what we do. But broadly in culture, there's still opportunity that's there.
Excellent. Well, Ed, as always, it's been great talking to you, hearing your insights. It's been encouraging hearing about the 2,000 to 3,000 people that you connected with as a church over the weekend through your Easter extravaganza. I'm just going to pray for you, and then I just want to talk about two quick events. So, I just want to quickly pray. Heavenly Father, thanks so much for your love, your goodness. Thanks for the opportunity that churches across the world had to celebrate the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Thanks that Jesus' resurrection changes everything. And we pray and ask that you give us a confidence to reach out with the great news of the gospel, and that your Spirit would mightily work in the hearts of people across the world and see them turn to you in faith and repentance. Amen. If you enjoyed hearing Ed today, you can see him in person and ask him questions in person. We've got two events coming up on the 20th and the 23rd in Sydney and in Brisbane, and Ed is also speaking in Melbourne on the 24th. Head along to genevapush.com/events and you can register for those two events. An opportunity to hear Ed in a masterclass speak on 4 topics that you have the opportunity to choose. So Ed's going to be speaking in Sydney on the 20th of April and on the 23rd in Brisbane on a number of different topics, a masterclass, if you will. The other event I want to draw your attention to is our National Church Planning Conference. That's in May, 18 to 20, multiply.com. An opportunity to hear from 2 excellent Bible teachers and church planners and speakers. Gary Miller from Ireland and now up at QTC will be speaking and opening up the book of Deuteronomy. And Steve Timmis, who's the Acts 29 Global Director, a planter from Sheffield in the UK. He'll be coming out and speaking as well. And of course, as always, the opportunity to hear from Australian church planters as well in the many workshops and the opportunities we'll have to chat around around the dining room table, around the lunchtime table, and the dinner table as well. So it'd be great to see you at that. That's Multiply 15. You can head along to multiply15.com. Multiply15.com. Well, thanks, Ed. It's been a pleasure talking to you again, and I look forward to seeing you in the next couple of weeks.
Sounds good. Good to talk to you. We'll see you soon.
Thanks a lot, Scott and Ed, for this morning's fantastic webinar, Christmas and Easter Losing Their Gospel Edge. Wow, there was so much, as always, tends to happen in the planter sessions. If you're a regular with us, you'll know this. so much information was handed out this morning that you may not have been able to get everything down. Well, the good news for you is that we've recorded this session, and within the next couple of days, we'll be sending you an email about how you can link to the video and the audio files of Ed and Scott's discussion, so you can go back, take notes, and share it with as many people as you possibly can. Now, before I wrap up, I'm just going to point to one other event that Scott didn't mention, that our next planner session, our next webinar coming up, is the M Word. The M Word is coming up. So please join us for that. Go to genevapush.com to register. We look forward to your participation in the M Word, where we're going to be talking about money. That's right, people, money, and how to talk about money at church with Rod Irvine and Stu Starr. Now, before I do finish off this morning's session, I have to again thank our webinar sponsors, EA Insurance and Christian Super. As I mentioned at the start, Christian Super are behind the planner sessions, and they're also behind many churches and schools and Christian-owned businesses across Australia. If you want to know how to invest your super along biblical lines, along your Christian values, head along to christiansuper.com.au. And thanks also to EA Insurance, who help out so many church planning groups with all their insurance needs. And for more information on insurance, go to ea.org.au. On behalf of our guest this morning, Ed Stetzer, who was so great, wasn't he? And our host, Scott Sanders, I'm Ben McKecken. We've been Geneva Push. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to you being with us at the next planner session.